everybody, and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Donald as usual. So we took a little bit of a break last week. Don wasn't feeling well, but I think he's fully recovered now, or at least mostly recovered. We're going to check in and see how we've been doing the past couple weeks and then answer some of your questions. So how you doing, Donald? You doing okay?
I'm doing pretty good. I had a cold for a bit. And, you know, like logically, you know, it's probably not corona, but you just kind of, it's like somewhere in the back of your mind, you're like, you know, I had like a chest cold. So my lungs were, you know, all gunked up, whatever. And I was like, that's not, you know, like that's the only thing that is on the news is people with their lungs gunked up or whatever. So it's like, okay, maybe I should take this seriously. But yeah, I don't know. I can't complain. I don't know. It's just, it worked its way out through whatever. So yeah,
it's weird. It's one of those things where it's like you don't want to get it, but then once you're kind of doing okay, you hope that that's what it is, so that you can beat it, and then have like antibodies and stuff. So kind of a weird situation.
I feel bad for all the people that have like other serious illnesses right now.
Yeah,
that are like you know, they're like cancer treatments are being postponed and stuff, and they're like, you know, because they must feel like, I don't know, you know, not only are they sick, but they're not getting any recognition for it or whatever. You know what I mean? Like they're not getting any like special help or whatever, or like deferment or whatever. You know what I mean? Like they're just, I don't know. Yeah. So
yeah, it's kind of a weird situation because I mean, I guess if you're like dangerously ill, it doesn't really matter what specific disease it is. Like that's just a life, you know. It's like a life that's threatened by one disease isn't more or less worth saving than another. You know, it's a weird situation. I read something about, I think it was maybe HIV or something like that. There was some sort of medicine or some kind of instruments that were being moved away from them and towards coronavirus stuff. And I don't know how dangerous HIV is anymore, but that just seems like a weird situation. It is like to be like allocating resources from one thing to another thing, unless it's like actually going to be like a net good in some way. Yeah,
that's hard because it's like obviously one of the sort of main moral things that the Catholic Church tends to hammer on a lot is like culture of life stuff. So they, you know, stuff about, you know, a lot of that is the pro-life activism and stuff, but there's also like a lot of stuff where they get really, you know, they fight in the courts and stuff about euthanasia and all that. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a weird situation because it's dealing with things where there's like an absolute constraint. It's not like a really, like the main thing that the church tends to fight against is things where it's like just discretion whether or not let someone die kind of thing, you know? Mm-hmm. And in this case, it's like an absolute constraint because it's like if we don't take that one thing from one person, you know, if we don't take the ventilator from one person, then we got to help, you know, then the other person will die kind of thing. It's not like, it's more like the overall situation that created that tension, whatever. But so I feel like it's hard because I think there's a lot of people that have that impulse right away. They're like, oh man, we can't just let people die. But then at the same time, it's like, it's an absolute constraint for some people. Someone has to make that decision at the end of the day anyway. So yeah,
right, yeah. I mean, that's the horrible thing about like Italy is that they've been having to make those kind of determinations. Like if you're older than a certain age, and I think the age limit kept dropping over the days and weeks. Like they were just cutting people off from medical care because it just was like a, you know, it's a numbers game. It's just about probabilities at a certain point. Like you have a scarcity of resources and you want to make sure you help as many people as possible. So certain people, it just ends up being better to save one over the other just because of the chances of survival and stuff like that. Pretty grim stuff.
yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I heard that I guess this study came out of the Gates Foundation, and I don't know how much to trust them or not. My inclination is just to take it at face value, but you know, you never know. But you know, they were saying that it seems like the peak is going to be below the limit of our capacity of our healthcare systems in most places. So that's good, I guess. So we're not going to see like an Italy style situation if things bear out the way that those reports say. Though I've also seen that that's like the only report that is saying that, and that there are other reports that are still saying it's going to be worse than that. So I don't know. The study was done at University of Washington, so I'm just like, out of loyalty, I'm like, yeah, okay. They probably know what they're doing over there. They do have like a top-notch medical research and hospital system at the university there, so I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea. I just, yeah. How is quarantine going for you? You're handling it okay?
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I could do this all the time. I really have no issues with this.
Yeah. Yesterday, I had a moment where I was very depressed, and the reason why was because I thought to myself, I could do this another year easy. Like, not even like, I was like, this would be so easy to do for like any other year. There'd be no problem for me. I'd just keep doing it. Who cares, kind of thing, right? And then I thought about that, and I was like, that's kind of sad in some ways. I don't know. That's like that I was mentally like fine with it. I was like, that's kind of, I don't know. That's not, you shouldn't think like that. I don't know. But then I was like, well, whatever. That's life.
Yeah.
I feel
that kind of takes me back to this idea that I've had since I was like a teenager or something. And it's like such a stupid idea, but some part of me sort of thinks there's some truth to it, is that I think I would be a very good prisoner. Like that I would get along just fine in prison, like as far as the living in a cell. Yeah. Someone brings you a tray of food, or you go to the cafeteria or whatever it is, that kind of situation. Yeah. That doesn't seem too bad. You don't have to get a job or anything, it seems cool. Obviously there's other parts of it, but
yeah. I would probably be a very good, so I don't know if I would actually be a good monk. I'd be like a good monk that was like, I'd be good at like being a monk that was sort of on the outs with the church or something, and they just had to like stay in like a monkish prison or something like that kind of thing. Because I wouldn't be able to do the prayers every day, like all day long or whatever. That would be too much work for me. But like the action, and then you have to like clean things and do all the manual labor. But like I don't know, maybe I would like rise to the occasion or something and just be really good at like sweeping and praying and chanting and stuff all day, and then so similar.
You could be one of those guys that transcribes the books,
Yeah,
like they used to have people that would just take a book and then like copy out a book, That seems like a good job for you. Whenever I read about like Sufi orders that they sort of functioned as guilds, like they had a certain craft and they would just kind of have like, they would work with leather or whatever they would do, they would have something like that, and then they would just do like sort of monastic style stuff. They would live communally, and a lot of their day was devoted to worship of various kinds, all that kind of thing. That seems like a pretty nice life. That seems pretty decent.
Yeah,
it's not totally cloistered and everything. You go to the market, you're selling your stuff, you have a craft that you're practicing, you meet with people, you are in contact with the real world, so to speak, but you also have your own thing going on, which I don't know, seems like a nice mix.
Today we're gonna do some questions here. There's the first question is sort of related, so I thought maybe I'll just dive into that.
Sure.
It says, Tom, do you have any favorite Islamic poetry? So I'm imagining you in one of those orders or something, and then just sitting there writing poetry or something like that. Yeah.
I kind of have like a superficial knowledge of Islamic poetry, so I don't really have like any deep cuts or anything to share. I think Rumi's really good, but you need to get a good translation, and a lot of the English translations are very editorialized, I guess you could say. Like they, when I say Rumi, you probably think of like new agey kind of hippie kind of stuff, and that's because of the way they've been translated. They really specifically tried to remove Islam specific things from it, so like stuff about God, stuff about the Prophet. They only translated ones that kind of they could universalize and kind of portray things a certain way and stuff. And that's that is kind of annoying, but he's very good, and he has like a interesting style and stuff. Like some of them are almost more like stories and stuff like that. I Hafez. Not a lot of names coming to me right now, to be honest. There is a writer that I do really like, who they're not poems, they're aphorisms. And I mean, this is also like a very obvious one for anyone who kind of knows their like Islamic texts, but Ibn Ata'illah wrote the Hikam, or the Book of Wisdoms, I think it's translated into in English. And yeah, it's aphorisms, right? So they're just like really short, like one-liners kind of a thing. And I like those. The book's organized by chapters. I think I've actually read from it on one of our Patreon episodes before, and it's great. Like it's just amazing. Like the reason I'm kind of thinking of this in terms of poetry is just because of the conciseness of the language and the density of everything in them. So I kind of nothing especially interesting, I guess, but I just like the standards.
I bought the Rumi one. I think it's about the Council of Burrs, or what was it called?
Oh, well, that's not Rumi. That is...
oh, no.
I'm blanking on it, but another Persian poet, yeah.
No, it's... Okay, then it wasn't that.
Attar, I got something Attar.
I got... Anyways, what's one of Rumi's, like, big ones? I don't know.
The Mevlevi is the big one.
What's that translate as?
I'm not sure if that gets translated as anything else. To be honest.
Okay. Okay. Well, anyways, I had one of them. Maybe it's just a selected poems from Penguin. It's like a recent edition.
Yeah.
It's like, are those the ones that you would warn against?
There are better translations coming out. I just haven't done like I haven't looked into it too closely. Yeah. I know that Coleman Barks is a fairly controversial translator that is, I think, still active and doing stuff, and anything from like the 90s or earlier you want to be careful about, and I don't know, you can find good translations if you if you just stay away from like picking up the first thing you find at a bookstore, that kind of thing. You want to just do a little bit of research.
I guess with Rumi and most of those, that there's probably a lot of cheap editions out that don't really, like, you know what I mean, like the store brand ones. And stuff
and I mean, so to be honest, it's not like they're bad or anything. It's just that they're not capturing what he was really writing about. So you're missing a big dimension of it. Now, if you're not interested in the religious aspect and you just think that they're nice poems or whatever, that's fine, I guess. But I don't know. I feel like being a Muslim, it's kind of annoying to see like Islamic poetry that has the Islam ripped out, and then like if I'm trying to read, if I'm looking for that and it's just like specifically removed, that's kind of obnoxious to me.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's there was actually it's funny, there's a similar sort of, not similar, but a parallel sort of issue with there was like a group called the Jesus Seminar. Have you ever heard of this? Or I think I mentioned it once, but it was a group that tried to look historically and say, what are the things that we could attribute to Jesus as sayings, for certainly that we don't think were like editorial additions later.
Like Christian Hadith science kind of thing.
Yeah. But in sort of a backwards way, where like the hadith to me always, my sort of layman's thing was that it's like almost an extension, right? Like it's like additional material that helps clarify things, right? Like that's part of it, or
yeah. I mean, it's different. It's not. Okay. The Quran is its own text. It's a complete text, and it stands alone. That's God's word. The Hadith is reports about the Prophet, things he said, things he did. And yes, that's supposed to help clarify what the commands are, how they're implemented. That's like an example. I wouldn't say that it's an extension, but it is like the idea of it being like almost a commentary on the Quran is there's some truth to that.
Sure. So the Jesus seminar was so it's almost like, well, in a respectful way to say it, but it'd be like if the hadith, I don't know. It's as if they were stripping away parts of the Quran or something, because it's the way that they're doing it is that they come up with basically like a few dozen sayings that they attribute to Jesus, and they say these are the ones that are probably actually true.
Okay.
And it's like stuff like so it's kind of it's almost like the reverse of the process of the hadith, where they just are eliminating large parts of the religion. And it's anyways it's funny because that is still within the sort of range of religion, because the people that are doing it are generally, they're still religious in some respects. They still like believe in God and stuff. But it tends to be like within the Aryan sort of fold, like not explicitly, like they would, I don't know if that's what they wouldn't self-describe, but like it's that sort of idea of Jesus as, friendly guy that, desert prophet kind of thing.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Not religious. Yeah. So I always, I used to, it's funny because that was probably my first, it worked backwards for me kind of in a way, where I was reading that kind of thing before I took it seriously. Like as an atheist, I was reading that kind of thing because I thought still a compelling story kind of thing. But, so I guess it, maybe in some ways it's good to at least have that out there. Maybe it's the same thing with the Islamic poetry kind of thing, where you read this kind of thing and then you go, wait a minute, there's more to this. And keep down that road or something.
I agree.
I don't know.
That was a similar thing for me. When I first converted, it was helpful to have this sort of like middle ground transitional material sort of stuff that was trying to, it was clearly in retrospect written by people who were trying to hold on to an identity tied to Islam, but were very embedded in like a Western kind of cultural thing, and they were just had like mixed loyalties and were trying to synthesize the two and stuff like that. But that was helpful for me as a convert to kind of as I was coming to understand what this religion was about and how it worked, and what are the authorities that I should look to and all that kind of stuff. It was helpful to have a way of doing that that wasn't like super jarring, and especially given the fact that I didn't have like a community around me or anything. Like I just kind of converted on my own. It was it's a process, it's a gradual thing, especially in that converting in that way. So yeah, I think it's a positive thing, even though I think it's also necessary to kind of like maintain a vocal critique of these kinds of things. I feel the same way about like perennialism. That worked the same way for me, where it was kind of like it's a way to come to understand like how to think about things in a religious way, which was something pretty new to me, and I sort of had to ease my way into it. It wasn't obvious to me, so there's a bit of like a transitional phase that's useful for.
Yeah, I had a similar thing with sort of similar perennialist sort of things, where I couldn't accept that, like, the plurality of religions proved to me at some level that religion wasn't true. Like, that was just a basic thing, because I thought, like, God couldn't speak to people in all these different ways and then have that specific religion still be true kind of thing. And I think part of what has helped with that is the understanding that, I don't even know how to say it, but that there's this deeper, I don't know if it's intuition or something like that, but there's like a deeper sort of natural knowledge or something that people have that doesn't necessarily have to be put into a specific religious thing. I do think it does necessarily, in the sense that, in a religious sense, I think it has to be necessarily, like, if you follow it all the way, you have to go down a religious path.
Right,
but,
yeah.
I think I do think there's just basic things like people that were living in North America before Christian contact or whatever, it's like they were not bad people or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
it's like stuff like that.
So I'm curious. I'm not sure if I've talked about this before, but so in Islam there's a concept called the fitra, and have I talked to you about this before?
I don't think so.
Okay,
no.
so the fitra is like the basic human instinct, or like the intuition is another way it's sometimes translated. It's like it's how human beings are created, right? It's like their basic default. And there's an idea of the people of fitra, and this is all in the Quran, so this is all like fairly it's not some elaborated later doctrine that's kind of derived from certain things or whatever. This is like pretty much in the basic foundational texts and stuff. That there is the Abrahamic like line that is the true religion, right? Like there's the one God, there's a line of prophets, but there have also been prophets that were sent to every community of people, and some prophets only had like 2 people that followed them, and some people had entire nations and stuff, and we're not even sure. There's a hadith that talks about over 100,000 prophets have been sent to mankind. And so people in other places, like you're talking about North America and all this kind of stuff, that they have had prophets that have taught them how to do things, and that they had their own laws and their own things like that, just like how before Muhammad there was a line of prophets and they had a different law. It wasn't exactly the same as the standing Sharia. They had their own Sharia that was for their specific community. And so Muhammad comes as the last prophet for all people. So it's at that point there's no more attempt to like divide people into community. Like there are communities, right? There are like different communities, but in a religious sense, it's now supposed to be everyone gets in the same boat kind of a thing. And that Sharia is meant for everybody and all that kind of stuff. So there's just always been this idea that people in different places, it's not so much about if they aren't already somehow following Islam without having ever heard of it before, then they're damned. It's more like if they're on the fitra, if they're following their innate kind of sense of morality and ethics and whatever their culture has sort of taught them is like a ethical lifestyle and all that kind of stuff, that's probably in some way derived from previous prophets, and so there's some good in it, or maybe lots of good in it, and that is that they will be judged according to those kinds of things. Now that doesn't mean that you are not trying to convert them and teach them about Islam and all that kind of stuff, because as I said, like Muhammad comes as the last prophet, so the religion is also intended for these people as well. But at the same time, it's not so much of like it's not like they need to be, their culture and their religion needs to be wiped out. It's more like it's like this Borg assimilation kind of a thing. Like it can all kind of be united in this one umbrella of Tawheed, of unity, right? Of unity of God and unity of people and everything like that. So I was just wondering, how does that compare to your understanding of like, I don't know if the church has specific teachings on this kind of stuff, or if there's sort of like a debate or what the situation is, but how does it compare?
So a lot of this is changed because it's not there. I mean, there's like a sense of the line of prophets and things like that, but the issue is that a lot of everything changes with the divinity of Christ. Like that's like the pivot. So it's different in the sense that so what happened was, like, the people of Israel had prophets, sent by God that were basically like had a special relationship with God, that he was kind of leading them towards a certain kind of, or like interacting with them towards a certain kind of purpose, and that sort of culminates in Jesus. And then Jesus then sort of transforms the situation with a new covenant that is universal. So it just so the people who were like we would call Jewish, like before that, they were judged, or like their relationship with God was like their own covenant with God that was through their prophets.
Okay.
The people outside of that, like Gentiles, they were expected to behave according to the natural response of, like, they had like an intuition of morality, and it's not like, the things that, like, the laws that were given to the Jewish people, like the sort of legalistic things, those were still sort of binding on other people. It's just that it was made explicit in this sort of prophecy and thing, and there's a weird kind of retroactive kind of thing where that, like, moral sense that people had. So the ideological structure of the religion, like the sort of natural, like the ideas of morality, that ended up sort of revealing itself to be the influence of Christ and stuff, and like God's direct work in the world. And so that's a bit different in the sense that, because it's not just like that the prophets had ideas that were being transmitted by God and kind of reflecting their good behavior and things like that. It was also like an actual, like, it's also the truth of the event kind of thing is built into the life of Christ and stuff. So that's I think that would be the main difference, is that, like, that's like
kind of like the broader narrative around it is different, obviously. But yeah, that's obviously important. Everything
gets united in the person of Christ, who is, like, individual Christians participate in his ministry. So it's like united as, like, the body of Christ, they call it. So, like, everyone participates in that ministry. So therefore, once you have knowledge of it, it's interesting, because there's a difference between ignorance at the level of so anyways, this is the key thing about this, though, is that's interesting. I just read a book about this, about, like, in response to confession, and just ideas around how you give up, like, come to terms with sin and that. And what they were saying is that, like, you're only really judged on your knowledge that what you're doing is wrong, kind of thing, mostly. Like, that's, like, the main thing. So people who don't have the full message can't really be judged in the same way that someone that, like, knows everything about it backwards and forwards.
That's interesting. So, that reminds me of something I think Al-Ghazali said about that works for good deeds as well. Like, if you're not aware of something being, if you're doing something, like, with bad intentions, or just, like, kind of mindlessly, you won't be rewarded. Even, like, for example, drinking a glass of water is considered a good deed that you will be rewarded for if you do it with kind of a mindfulness. Like, if you do it with gratitude to God for the water, if you're doing it with a sense of, like, I'm drinking water because my body needs water. I was given this body. It's a gift. All that kind of stuff. If you do that, you say Bismillah before you drink, all that kind of thing, then you're rewarded for that, to whatever extent that's worth. Obviously, it's a pretty minor thing, but those things add up, I guess. But if you just are drinking water just mindlessly, like most of us do all the time, then that's not going to count necessarily. So there's a intentionality is a really big thing when it comes to judgment in Islam. So I don't know, that's just interesting. Just kind of rung a bell for me there.
Yeah, that book, the Desert Fathers, the collection that I bring up a lot, that's what the book is basically about. Is throughout is intentionality, because it's like a lot of the little stories and stuff come down to people approaching very similar things in completely different ways, and it's still having a positive moral tale kind of thing. So, it just, and a lot of it is, it comes down to like arrogance and stuff, right? Like trying to avoid being humble and stuff.
Right.
That's like tends to be the moral, and it's hard because humility is always contextual, right? So it's like, it also has like, it's so contextual that something that would be, you know, like doing the necessary thing without taking special credit and stuff can mean a lot of different things depending on what's happening. So sometimes you have to be decisive, and sometimes you have to like defer and stuff. And anyway, so I think that's interesting. It's good because it's I don't know. It's like, I think it's funny because, you know, a lot of moral things end up becoming these rules that don't reflect people's actual lives, I think, a lot of the time, like when they get talked about popularly. And so
I think it's really important to understand these things, whether you're trying to understand like thinking in a religious way, like the religious view on the world, because we're not really, I mean, some people are, but I know for myself, I was brought up completely a-religious, and I think a lot of people, it's a very minor or auxiliary part of the way they think about things. And when you center it really, you need to center that kind of stuff. You know, you need to really think about those sorts of aspects first and start from there when you start to think about like specific moral teachings and ethical teachings and stuff like that, or else you get into very weird territory. And I think it helps to it just helps with like negotiating that kind of difference, you know, when the kind of broader public is secularized and there's either a lack of religious, you know, background to it, or just a mix of different religions, such that you kind of have to work in this sort of like lowest common denominator stuff, which is great. Like that's fine. But it helps to have an understanding of like intention. It comes first, and then your action should be based on that, as well as, you know, the specific teachings then inform you from there. But you need to start with like, what's my intention here, and is this action going to get to that place that I'm shooting for, right? Like, am I going to, you know, like especially with like a lot of stuff in Sharia, it can come across as like very weird or off-putting or rude or whatever in a Western context. So all that stuff has to be taken into account when you're interacting with people and all that kind of thing. And also when you're judging other people's actions, like, you know, it would be ridiculous if I was walking around and like saw someone eating a bacon sandwich or whatever, and, you know, saw like a liquor store and, you know, all this kind of stuff, like, and just like was like freaking out about like, oh my God, what an immoral world or whatever. But it's, if they're not Muslim, it's not immoral in that sense for them to be doing that, like, because they just aren't abiding by the same guidelines. So, you know, and that has always made sense to me, but I'm glad that that's like there in the tradition. It's not something I have to kind of like, you know, do my own thinking on, that it's actually like a confirmed, verifiable like basis for the whole tradition.
Yeah, I feel the same way about this idea that like people that are sort of ignorant of the religion and its sort of specifics are still familiar with it in some intuitive or moral way or something. I think that's good to know in some ways, because that is not the way that it gets portrayed on TV. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, the evangelical movement in the United States and stuff it's quite the opposite a lot of the time. It's, you know, like this idea that if you are doing something they don't like, then by necessarily it's like you're being as evil as possible or something.
Yeah, so, I mean, and I think this kind of thinking is useful for non-religious thinking or worldviews as well. And I think that that's lacking as well. Like, you see people who have their own sort of like political ideologies or their own kind of like cultural ideologies or whatever, and they aren't understanding that there's, you know, you have to judge people according to their intentions, according to the, you know, they have a way of understanding things, and it's going to be different from yours in some way, and sometimes it's going to be very different, and that you can't just kind of take your structure of ethics and just impose it on other people and see, not like physically impose it, but I mean like in terms of judging them, like look at their behavior according to your ethical structures and just kind of be like, okay, well, wrong. So therefore this person is evil. This person, you know, we need to keep him out of the country or whatever, that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I see that on the left, the right, the center, everywhere. So, yeah, I mean, that's and it's difficult to do that, you know. I think if you probably shouldn't be running around judging other people in the first place, but like if you're going to do it, you need to kind of have a little bit of nuance and whatnot about it. Anyway, should we go on to question number 2?
yeah, sure. Okay, so this one's for me. It says, Don, what's the deal with the NDP? Any Bernie or Corbyn energy coming from them? So the short answer is no. The NDP is our Social Democratic Party in Canada. It mostly operates, well, actually, I was going to say it mostly operates in English Canada, but that's not true. They do have some presence in Quebec. They had a big one recently, but then it kind of fell away. So the NDP for non-Canadians, it's sort of like, I would say almost halfway between the Labour Party and the Democratic Party of the United States. So it is officially a Labour Party, like the unions are officially members of it, but it is not, that was like a long process that sort of came about in the 60s mostly, and just before that, like it wasn't a Labour Party in the sense that, in the traditional sense, like our socialist movement tended to be more prairie populists and intellectuals and things like that. It was not the same sort of industrial movement across the whole country as it was in other countries. So I mean, that's the problem is that so because of that too, we don't have a Corbyn in the sense that we don't have sort of traditional left-wing fringe of the NDP that, you know, sits in Parliament and sort of hammers on the good fight or whatever, you know, kind of thing. That doesn't really exist in Canada. We do have a few people that tend to be okay, but that sort of broad left fringe that sort of perennially fights in leadership elections and stuff, not really there. And then the other side of it is that we do have a bit more of a tradition of social democratic protest, though, than the United States, in the sense that I think a lot of NDP staffers and people like that, like the sort of NDP activist types, a lot of them like Bernie, I think, and are like pro-Bernie in general. A lot of the like elected people, I think they like the idea of someone like Bernie or Corbyn even, but I think a lot of it at the higher levels is totally superficial. Like it has no relationship to, like they think of themselves as being, I think, a protest movement that, you know, actually is, you know, affecting change and stuff. But in reality, it never, as soon as they get into power, it just has no relationship to its past protest kind of stuff, really. I do think they are like the lesser evil in Canada, like the major parties, like they're fine, like compared to them. But that is such a low bar that it's like, you know, it'd be nice if either they or another left party emerged. But at this point, the problem is that like the only left alternatives that even exist on paper are like the Communist Party and stuff. So there's no reason to, I mean, outside Quebec has its own sort of left social democratic party called Quebec Solidaire, which is a bit better, but it's one of those things where it's so easy to just list all the reasons why the NDP sucks. Like that's just like there's so many things, like say in Alberta, they ended up coming to power in a surprise election, like a surprise win, and in some respects, and then just totally became an extension of the oil industry, even though the oil industry hated them. So it just, and then they collapsed in the next election, and, you know, there wasn't much gain from any of that. And, you know, they're not, it's like one of those things where it's like in the United States, and, you know, if the governor's a Democrat, that's better than if it's a Republican a lot of the time. But it's such a low bar that it's like, you know, I wouldn't want to spend much time on it kind of thing. So, yeah.
I have a question
Anyways,
about Canadian left stuff that I don't. You probably don't want to get too deep into this, but I was just curious about Tommy Douglas. That's the healthcare system guy, right?
Yeah. So he, what his? Sorry, what was the? Is that
well,
the
my question was just like, if there was no left for him to come from, where did he come from? Like, was he sort of from this like NDP style faction of things, or did he come from some kind of left field sort of thing, or what was his background politically?
Yeah. So there's a party that was called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation before the NDP was founded, and so they were around in like the 30s and 40s and 50s, and their whole thing was sort of democratic socialism. They started off pretty radical, but they were still like they were to the right of the communists. Like they were always critical of the communists and sort of but they were pretty solid democratic socialist party. But in the West, they were mostly connected to like Tommy Douglas and like people like him are like Christian preacher types.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And they were very connected to like rural people and farmers and stuff, right? So a lot of because Canada used to be obviously similar to the United States in this, that mostly agricultural resource kind of stuff, and sort of that lingered on later in most of the country. So that it would be people that it was not like there were, major cities, relatively for where there was like, industrial worker kind of faction kind of things. But so he was from Saskatchewan, which is mostly it's like basically known for like wheat, right? Like that's like it's kind of, anyways, it's like a farmer province, and now it's like resources and that too. But so what he did is he came to power in Saskatchewan as like the leader of Saskatchewan, and his platform, part of it was breaking the doctors' unions and stuff, like building a hospital insurance system which covered everyone, and that required the doctors to basically agree to enter into a relationship with the government instead of just being small time practitioners kind of thing. I mean, they still theoretically are, but it was towards it wasn't like a full NHS, but it was sort of like that kind of thing, towards that model. And he kind of stared them down and proved that you could do it. Like it's sort of like the United States, where there was like a lesson that people take that from all the healthcare stuff, is that anytime that you go up against them and try to build a real insurance system, they'll just completely destroy you and politically, right? Like that's the sense. Like people like Obama, didn't even put in a public option for health insurance in his plan because he thought that they would just completely, and made a lot of concessions towards their profitability and stuff. And that was sort of the lesson that the United States had learned. But in Canada, that was like a huge event, because it proved that, number one, there was popular support for that, and then number two, there was a method to sort of push it through. And it took decades for Canada's healthcare system to sort of become what it looks like now, but that was a sort of watershed moment. Anyways, and then he moved to the sort of national stage and became leader of the CCF, like federally, and sort of built this new movement that tried to unite sort of new left people that were leaving the communist movement and labor organizers and stuff, and to create the NDP. And he never he never won a federal election. Like the NDP never got to that point where, like, the most seats the NDP has ever won was in 2011, when they became the opposition. And that sort of so it's always been really, there's been a few times when they've sort of supported federal governments, very rarely, and generally they just have been sort of it's been at the provincial level where had done most of their work. And even there, it's like, there's a lot of provinces where they're in power for like 10 years, not much actually changes, and they actually like end up sort of gaining the hatred of a lot of the left. So it's yeah, it's annoying because it's like there's so many things that they could be doing that would be positive, and like one time the leader of the Ontario NDP here, one of her election campaigns once had almost nothing about poverty, like it had very little plan towards addressing poverty in Ontario, and it had like stuff in it like we're going to cut taxes on gasoline and stuff, just totally tone deaf, or like taxes on electricity or something like that, like stuff that is like counterproductive for environmental reasons, expensive, and doesn't actually help the people that should be helping, kind of thing. Yeah. It's like, I don't know, stuff like that. So
all right.
The next question is, as Chomsky fans, what is your interpretation of the charge that he was wrong on the wrong side of the Cambodian genocide?
Yeah, so he was sort of like skeptical of the claims that were coming out about the Khmer Rouge, is that right?
Yeah, he was like, I think it was almost like one of those things where he said, I think someone came up with a big number of people that died or something, and he's like, do we actually have evidence for that or something like that? He like wrote like a preface to a book that was skeptical of it or something like that, and it's, yeah, anyway.
Well, I don't know, I guess it's like a tradition at this point for the left to be like genocide, not exactly denialist, but like just asking questions kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I always, I don't know. I feel like anytime that you're listening to other people give information, it's just like a stream of stuff that mostly you're going to either sort of accept but not really know where to put it into your own framework yet, or you're going to reject outright and just kind of move on. I don't know why. Like, it's like, are you going to like live with Chomsky and then talk about this all the time or something? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's a strange thing to me where people, like, I don't know what they want me to do with that information if they think that he was actually like pro Pol Pot or something. You know what I mean? Like, what,
yeah.
Like, you just kind of go, okay, well, like maybe if he was like running for president, that would be something you might want to think about, that he sometimes like, but yeah, even then it's like, is Chomsky the person that is credulous about state crimes or something? I don't know. Like, it's like, what is the goal here? There's another one that he did, like he, in the Afghan war, when it first was like starting up, I think it was the United Nations World Food Program or something, said that hundreds of thousands of people could die from hunger. And he was kind of promoting that a lot, being like, what Bush is doing is like knowingly causing a genocide, basically, because there's a risk that the hunger will kill like large numbers of people and stuff. And people are kind of, they use that as a thing, being like, well, he ended up wrong on that mostly. So therefore, he was like a scaremonger kind of thing, and it's funny because it's like
scaremonger about the Iraq War,
no, about Afghan
or Afghan war. Yeah, sorry.
But yeah. But I don't know. I like what's the goal there? I don't know. It's funny because there's so many people that I disagree with on things, and sometimes it makes me really mad when, like, if I trust them and I agree with them on a lot of other stuff, I can get like overly angry about it. I can accept that, but I feel like that's like my problem. I don't know. It's like not like, do you know what I mean? Like, I should just be able to read something that someone says and move on, kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Yeah. I mean, just on the specific Cambodia thing, I think it's his response. Back then, information was not as easy to access as it is today. So it is more reasonable in that light to kind of consider, like, it's perfectly reasonable to kind of wait and see kind of a thing. Plus, it's not like he had any actions he could have taken at that moment that would, there wasn't anything depending on him taking decisive action about things. Like if he had come out pro or con or whatever, it wouldn't really change anything. So for him to just kind of be like, well, I don't know, what's the source on this? fine, whatever. It's easy to look back now and do that kind of stuff. But like, you see how people like, earlier this year we were all freaking out about going to war with Iran for like the 17th time in the last few years or whatever. So, he's, I don't know. It's a reasonable thing to kind of like wait and see on stuff. But, I don't think today that he would have any kind of denialist sort of opinions about Cambodia or anything. So,
yeah. So this next question is for both of us. Do you ever find it hard to reconcile your religion with your fuck the mods point of view?
There's parts of Islam that kind of work very well with that. The idea that like all sovereignty belongs to God, that that every other person is just a human being, and that they're supposed to be serving God and not kind of just exercising whatever authority they've been given in whatever manner they choose, all that kind of stuff. There's also sort of like, if I want to be, you can kind of go like that Islamist sort of like kind of route of like Islamist in the sense of like the Al-Qaeda, like Salafi, Takfiri kind of thing, where like everyone else is a idol worshiper and all that kind of stuff. And so like that kind of can work in that. I mean, I don't really go for all that kind of take on stuff, but that kind of works. Like there's definitely a lot of people on Twitter that have like very strong Islamist or pro-Islam kind of views on things. And then they're also like, they kind of have like alt-right nationalist side, kind of like meme humor, so that kind of can work. But obviously then there's also like, in a more genuine sense, like there's a lot of stuff about like you need to like observe the rules of whatever communities you're a part of, and you should be like someone that people can come to and know that they're safe, and that you don't hurt other people's feelings and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I kind of think of it like it's not the mods who I need to be worried about. Like they are probably in the wrong on most of these kind of issues where I would have conflicts with them. But that doesn't mean that I'm also right in, even if they're wrong, I could be wrong too,
Yeah. I think it's the Christian faith kind of goes very strongly a lot of the time towards the idea that if people are criticizing you and trying to tear you down, and because of your religion, then that's proof that you're right, kind of thing. Like that's like, because like you're being tested and kind of being like, I mean that's one of the things it's very, it can end up dangerous, because it's like, I mean it can end up dangerous if it's not true at some level, but like it's yeah, a lot of Jesus was canceled and stuff like that. So like, it's like stuff like that, and I think that's, yeah, I think that's true. But then there's always obviously been the sort of imperial religious side of things, where the a good order of society and all that, and obviously for a lot of European history, the church had a very direct role in managing things, and I don't know. I mean, obviously, personally, I tend towards the, fringe outsider sort of thinking on that, like of being like, it's better to be, people call it like a poor church or something like that. Yeah, like it's better to, at least theoretically, like it's not like you don't need to have the architecture of like, at some level, success in this world is not necessarily a sign that things have worked out right, kind of thing, like this. It's a lot of the times you sort of know what's right in your heart, and a lot of other people are telling you you're an idiot, kind of thing, like it's not necessarily the fact that one follows from the other. So, which is funny, because there is obviously a large trend in both evangelical Christianity, and then I think it leaks over into a lot of other things, where success is proof of God's beneficence or whatever, like it's like prosperity gospel stuff, where like if you're rich, it's because God wants you to be rich, kind of thing, like, and that's not, I don't know if that's healthy. Yeah. So
yeah, no, I kind of get that. I think I have a sort of like personally ingrained sense of that kind of martyrdom thing that you're talking about of
Yeah.
like I think like I have this contrarian impulse where if I start to see a lot of people are kind of like saying something and it's not exactly on point with all the kind of nuance that I would want that kind of idea to be articulated with, I'll just go kind of hard against it, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that sort of I get that feeling of like when people are telling me I'm wrong or I'm dumb or whatever, that then I'm like, yeah, see, like I'm right. Yeah, I kind of get that feeling, and that doesn't come from a religious sense or anything really. For me, it's just like kind of my own personal like psychology.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So the next question, what's the deal with the World Bank? Why does the left wing hate it so much? Yeah, it's funny. This used to be like 20 years ago. This was like the most central question on left wing kind of stuff. And I think part of it was because in the 90s, you had this, New World Order stuff kind of thing, like the emergence of these recognition of the power and the results and the emergence of these giant international institutions. It's kind of funny because, I mean, people like Bernie Sanders were, involved in that, I guess, in different ways, like in being critical of it. But the American left doesn't really talk about these kind of things as much as they used to. Like, it does not really, they talk more about like war and peace kind of stuff, and like if at all at the international level, and then not as much about like, I don't find that you don't have, and then maybe climate change, but like stuff like the World Bank and IMF and stuff have kind of fallen out of the view as compared to stuff like Medicare for All or whatever. And yeah, anyways, the point being is that what the World Bank and IMF and stuff would do is countries would be heavily indebted for some sort of project or something or whatever, and the World Bank and the IMF would work together to create programs for them to correct their finances over time, was the theory. And those would be the worst. It would be like, it was the equivalent of like the Bush people that did Iraq, where like it was always like, 20-year-olds telling a government to be like, you need to get rid of food subsidies for the population because that, you're distorting the market and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it was really a lot of the things that ended up happening in the United States, like with welfare reform and all that, were like field tested in other places like South Africa. And it's just gutting the programs and stuff. So I'm actually surprised that I think part of the things that have changed is, one is that you have like China involved in sort of like, there's been a shift away from, I think, from the international leverage of that. And also sort of, there's been alternatives that have been created, like in South America, there's alternatives that they created for like a development bank and all those kind of things. So there was such a reaction against it. I think that there was a shift, but there was also an issue where the World Bank and other people like that became very, very heavily invested in public relations stuff. So they knew that these things were happening, all these protests and that. And so like the World Bank, I think their official motto is something like, we dream of a world free of poverty or something. Like, it's like, it's really become, they're very careful about how they position everything now so that they don't get attacked. And so I don't know. I feel like it's one of those things where it should be talked about a lot more, these kind of things. But I think it's also true that, Bernie Sanders has proven, and Corbyn to some extent has proven, that you do have to talk about what relates to people's everyday expenses and experiences and stuff, like not being able to afford medications or something, rather than sort of economic structure at a deep level or something, or else people just won't respond to it in the same way. But yeah.
I've always thought of like World Bank policies as being like, if you hired an economic advisor and you were like in deep trouble, like you were having trouble coming up with money for rent the next month or something, the guy was like, well, look at this, you got a fridge full of food, why don't we set up a little stand outside, you just sell all this stuff, and then use that to pay your rent. Yeah, I actually was thinking, I wonder if like 9/11 had an effect on discourse to kind of shift things away from these like international organizations and stuff and focus more on like what the U.S. is doing as a nation state. And then that kind of has rolled into this, like now there's the left focus on things like Bernie Sanders and Corbyn and all that kind of stuff, where it's like, what can we do at the electoral level for this country? And it, you know, generally speaking, nationalism has kind of had this resurgence and stuff. And I don't know, it's kind of an interesting idea to think about. I haven't really thought about it too much, just thought of it right now, but yeah, something to consider.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I think that for the first few years, like of the 2000s, it was still the case where there was still a lot of activist talk and protests around, you know, they would call it globalization or something. And I think that still existed and then I think that really, yeah, you're right. That when Iraq started going badly and they started looking like they might even extend it, you know, like when stuff like, yeah, I think you're right. And I think that it's also stuff like Israel ended up sort of taking part of that mental space where the Intifada and the Lebanon war and then Gaza and stuff, like I think that ended up being a focal point of international anger along with Iraq and stuff, where it got translated into security terms, like in the left imagination. And then, yeah, I mean, and then it just, and then I guess the world global financial crisis happened and people had, you know, their own concerns for even places in Europe, like marginal Europe, like Greece and stuff. So, yeah.
Yep.
So the next question is, how does Tom feel about female genital mutilation, beheadings, stoning to death, and arranged marriages? So one of our perennial, I don't know if it's a troll Islam question, but or I'm going to be generous and say it's a troll Islam question.
Yeah, I think those are all wonderful things. I think we should import them to the U.S. Do us a lot of good. So let's go through the list real quick. So female genital mutilation is outlawed in 3 of the 4 schools, and in the one school that it's permitted, it is it's actually pretty much in coherence with like what I forget which specific organization. It's one of the major health organizations in the world. There's a difference between the way that they circumcise people that is essentially just like a cosmetic thing, and then the full-on FGM stuff, which is just, well, you know, it is mutilation. It's exactly what that is. So I'm not trying to say it doesn't happen, but where it does happen, it happens. It's practiced by non-Muslim and Muslim communities alike. So it's more of a regional cultural issue than it is a religion specific issue. So yeah, I don't think it's good. I'm totally fine with the Islamic take on it. What was the next thing?
The next thing is beheadings.
Oh, that's fine. I got no problem with that.
I have gotten angry about this kind of stuff now because like people talk about guillotining people a lot online, and I don't know, ends up being tacky, and so I've accused them of being ISIS supporters in that way. But stoning.
Yeah, I mean that seems pretty rough. I don't know if I could participate in something like that. I don't know. I mean, a lot of these types of things are supposed to happen so seldom that I am pretty sure that they've probably happened more in the past like 100, 200 years than they ever have like occurred before that time. The
Sure.
standards of evidence and all that kind of stuff were so high, and people were really reluctant to actually like come down and say like, yeah, this actually has to happen. That when it did happen, it was, you know, someone who was such a flagrant criminal or whatever, you know, that or it was some, you know, the leader wasn't very good or whatever. That as a concept, I don't have a problem with it, like in the broad historical view or whatever. And I don't think that capital punishment is necessarily beyond the pale, given a government or whatever, some kind of polity that is governed justly in all other ways. I don't have a real issue with capital punishment being on the books and all that kind of stuff. So Stoning just seems kind of brutal, though, to be honest. Like I think that the Sharia is accommodating to, like, I don't want to use the term updating because that kind of implies a sort of teleology that I don't want to subscribe to, but a sense of like adapting punishments to the culture of the time and place. So like there were some polities that pretty much did away with all the standard like Sharia punishments and all that kind of stuff and just implemented them in the form of fees. One thing to take into consideration is that in Islam that prison is not widely used. It's considered cruel to like steal someone's time away from them. So something like if someone is a thief and I think I've talked about this before, but people always use this example of like getting your hand cut off for stealing an apple. And that's so weird to me because that is specifically the example used in Islamic texts and in like by the example of the caliphs and stuff of when to not implement the hand chopping thing. It's more like if someone's like embezzled like a big, you know, like what was his name, Bernie Madoff or, you know, something like that, then that would be an instance where that may come into play, where it's like, okay, you are a thief, like you didn't steal an apple because you were poor and hungry. That you would just be let free for that. Like that's a failure of the state to provide for you. But if you're like a thief on that level, then that's where that kind of comes into play. And I don't have a problem with that. And I think historically there's a view that is less, I don't know, I can't find the word for this, less, the just punishment for that is to remove the hand and then let him go free like that. Now everyone knows he's a thief and he has to live like that, you know. Someone brought this up on a podcast I was listening to. I think it was Mark Norman and Joe List, and they were talking about how, you know, Muslims have the left hand for wiping and the right hand is for the handshakes and stuff. But what if someone has their hand cut off? Now they got to figure that out because you don't have the two hands to do things with. I thought that was pretty funny. And they were like, I wonder which hand they cut off. And he was like, oh, it's got to be the left, you know. It's like, well, no, you got to have the wiper. So
yeah.
But yeah, I don't have a problem with that stuff either. I don't like the way that it's being implemented in like Saudi Arabia or whatever, that kind of stuff. Like I think that's a deeply corrupt state and that they don't care at all about kind of adhering to Islamic norms. They just like that they can kind of point to medieval legal texts and be like, yeah, we're going to do this because God said so. So
yeah. The last one was arranged marriages.
Oh, yeah, that's also fine. People make such a big deal out of that. Like, I mean, there's a difference between arranged marriage and forced marriage, right? Like, if someone is forced into something, coerced into something, then, again, that's not permitted under Sharia. But if that is just, you know, a lot of cultures practice this kind of thing where you, like, arrange marriages. And I don't know. It's not for me, obviously. It's not for... you know, in Western culture, that's just not how we do things. So it's going to seem kind of alien to us and like something that wouldn't work for us. But that's okay for it to not work for us and for it to work for other people. I don't know. It's pretty basic, like respect thing there. A lot of people from those places that do it, like in India and whatever, they don't like it, and they you know, there's this whole thing about love marriage and stuff. But there are people who are perfectly happy with it too. So I think it's one of those things where it's just like, I don't know, like people do things differently. I think that people can kind of, does it make such a big difference whether you like met over like some app or at the grocery store at a bar or whatever, and then like fell in love with each other and then like did it that way versus like it was an arranged thing and you fell in love because you were spending time together and you kind of like learned how to, you know, be a couple together. I don't know. Is it that, you know, people get married pretty young here too, and it works out fine, and we don't think of that as like some kind of like strange thing or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. People just being overly touchy and a little bit chauvinist about that particular thing. The FGM and the stoning, I kind of understand the problems that people have.
Yeah. With the arranged marriage thing, it kind of makes me think of... It reminds me of when people are like, you should do what you love for your job and stuff like that kind of thing. Like that similar sort of thing where most people throughout history have just been forced to do specific jobs, more or less, by their situation, and those jobs have been terrible. So, like, you know what I mean? It's stuff like, or like, you know, like they've been hard jobs. They're not like, you know, doing PR for a NGO or something like that kind of thing, right? It's like, it's you're doing something like working the fields according to strict rules that you sort of inherited or whatever and stuff like that.
Yeah,
so
marriage is a lot like
I feel
that,
like, yeah, but I just mean that, like, it probably wasn't even one of the, for most people, it was like one of the good things about their life. Even like, it wasn't like, it wasn't like, I don't know. I think we kind of look back and sort of project back on a lot of that stuff too, where we assume that, yeah, I don't know, like that we assume that it's like a negative thing for people that necessarily, didn't necessarily view it that way, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I came across once was an interesting point, and I forget exactly where it was, but it was just bringing up the idea that the way that, so in Islam, the preferred thing to do is to get people married young. Like, you know, just don't waste any time. Like, as soon as they're adults, marry them and have them kind of just be married from there on. And that kind of prevents, you know, that's a big problem today, because it's like we're living in a culture where people are supposed to date and all that kind of stuff, but the religion says you're not supposed to do that. So it's like there's this big conflict there. So the way it's supposed to be done is that people are just like married out the gate, and that's taken care of. And so it brought up the point of, like, you know, this protects people from like heartbreak and from like kind of wasting time and like, you know, all this sort of stuff. And I was just thinking about, like, that's true. We kind of take it for granted that there's like this period of your life where you're dating and looking around, and it's like, it's like a job interview kind of thing, where like you go to one, you don't get it. You go to one, you don't get it. It's the same thing, right? Like and you just log on to Twitter any day and you see the kind of ravages that this has on people's psychology. You just see like how many people are just completely driven crazy, like just stuck in this kind of stuff. So, you know, there's in the same way that we only kind of see the negatives of the other side when we're looking at this, I think we also only think of the positives in terms of like the way we do things. And we don't think about, like, well, maybe there are certain negatives that are just like totally removed from the picture when we do things a different way.
Sure. So the next question: if the current Chinese government isn't a communist government, what would you guys say it is?
I call them communists. I call them Red China.
Yeah. I guess my opinion on this, I've been thinking about this, and my opinion on it now is basically, in most situations, it's up to the other person to decide whether or not they think it's a good socialist government.
Sure.
And then once I've heard their answer, if they think it is a good socialist government, I would say I'm not socialist then. You know, like, I'm like, okay, that's fine. If you think that's a good socialist government and it's all doing kind of things that you would want a socialist country to do, then socialism is not good.
Right.
And then if it's not a socialist government and you think that there's, you know, you could ask more of them in different basic ways, then maybe I'm a socialist then. So that's my sort of thing on that. I think that it's very bizarre, the debate that's kind of gone on online recently and that kind of stuff, where it seems so disconnected. There's so many, I would say there's like a huge, well, small, but like cottage industry now of people that like blog about this kind of stuff in different ways. And a lot of it is, it's very strange to me. It's like people talking about, you know, like, their opinions on these kind of things. I saw one blog that was about how Vietnam's response to coronavirus is like proof that it's like a great socialist kind of country, because there's no deaths so far from it. And I don't know. It's like, I don't know. It's just, it's the exact same as when people are like, well, deficits are smaller under Democrats than Republicans, so they're better managers of money or something. It's like that level of like debate, or like, it's so nonsense to me that it's like, I don't know. It does make me frustrated though, because it's like smart people that I know just saying things that are like completely wrong. So it's like, I don't know, I feel bad, but yeah.
Right. And then, okay, so what does that say about South Korea? South Korea is definitely not socialist, right?
Yeah.
So what does that say about their economic? Does that mean that their economic system is also very good? Is it perhaps better than Vietnam's if they handled it better than Vietnam did? I don't know. It's just a weird way to put things, I guess. I think people run into these problems where they start to think of socialism or communism equals good, and then it's instead of thinking about like the specific state, the specific policies, are these good or bad, and allowing people to be wrong even if they happen to kind of, you know, claim to adhere to a certain ideology that you like or whatever. Like, you know, you kind of have to get away from that when you start to deal with the real world, because that's not really how the real world works. You don't like pick an ideology, roll your stats, and then enter the world as like a D&D character. It's just not how it works.
Sure. The next question is, did you guys know that Mad Money's Jim Cramer used to be a Spartacist / Trotskyist?
I didn't know that. That's cool. That guy's funny.
Yeah, he's I don't know. I always feel like I don't know. It's weird that like people take advice from those types of people. Like, I don't know. Are there people? I guess there's got to be people at home that like watch those kind of TV shows and then act on the information by trading themselves and stuff. And I wonder if any of them make any money at all. I don't know.
Yeah,
because it's
I mean, probably some people, but I imagine a lot of people are watching it to get a sense of what other people are thinking or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. And the Sparts are like a particularly strange version of this. I think it's funny. I always think this is funny too about Quebec. A lot of I think I've mentioned this before, but like a number of people who were prominent in Quebec society recently had their roots in the Maoist movement. So the leader of a major political party in Canada, the Bloc Québécois, Gilles Duceppe, he was a Maoist organizer in a union for a few years, or like for a while, I guess. I'm not sure how long, but like in the 70s or 80s. And, you know, then end up leaving that and ended up, becoming a major political figure in Canada for, 2 decades, 3 decades, something like that. So, and then another one is Pierre Carl Pelado, who he became leader. He ended up inheriting, I think, and making a bunch of money in things like the media and stuff like that. And he ended up becoming leader of a provincial political party that like is like a governing party, Parti Québécois sometimes. And he was a Maoist as a youth too. And I don't know, it's funny to like see these people that had all these, I feel like that would be a cancel-worthy thing in the United States to do that, you know?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, most of them, I don't know. It would be hard. And these are like people on the broadly progressive side of politics too. Like, it's not like something where it's like Reagan or something where he's like, I used to be a Democrat and now I'm it's like the opposite valence kind of thing. It's like a person that, there's not like the right-wing redemption arc story to it. It's just like, oh yeah, I became a normal person. I don't know. It's like, I don't know. So yeah.
Yeah.
There was also a banker, I can't remember his last name, but his nickname at the bank was Red Ed. And it was because when he was younger, he wrote about like the socialist economics of Tanzania and stuff like that. Like it just, and he became one of the Canada's leading bankers and ended up like advising the government in Ontario on a bunch of different major structural reforms. And I don't know, that's kind of a funny thing to me too, that he, I don't know. I like that. It's funny to me that like people, it reminds me almost of like the Soviet Union or something turning into Russia or something, where all these people used to be in communist parties and then got like real jobs under neoliberalism or something. So
yeah.
So, did you want to do more questions, or you want to leave it there?
We could maybe finish with one quick fun one if you have one like that.
Okay, I'll ask this quick one. Is anime sinful or otherwise degenerate? If so, I would enjoy listening to an entire episode denouncing its evil influence. If not, could you please do an episode talking about which animes you enjoy?
Okay, so I don't have. If in a vacuum, I would have zero opinion about anime. In fact, like my first encounter with anime was when I was living in Asia growing up, and it was just, to me, it was like that was Asian that was just how they draw. You know, that's just the Asian drawing style. You know, so now it's become like this subculture, and people have like this intense hatred or this intense passion about it or whatever, and I find that extremely annoying, and I would like to have no part of that. And I've seen a few of them. I watched an episode of Evangelion the other day for the first time, and I just don't get it. I don't get it. I don't really like it. It seems really silly, and yeah, I just don't care for it very much. I saw some of the like the artier ones that people always recommend, like I think it's called like Ghost of the Butterflies or something, Ghost of the Fireflies, something like that, about the World War II. That was kind of interesting just to see that as like, okay, this is almost in like this is how the Japanese are thinking about the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all that. I don't know. On that level, it was kind of that was interesting to watch.
Have you seen Akira?
Yeah, that also like that was just, I don't know why people think that's so great. You know, I don't get it.
Ghost in the Shell.
Haven't seen that one.
Cowboy Bebop.
Nope. Yeah, so you're a little secret anime fan, aren't you?
I used to be, but honestly, it was 20 years ago.
Okay.
Like it was like in like late high school or something. I had a friend, Adrian, who was really into this kind of stuff early on, and it was like so he had. What are the ones that, not VCR, what's the VHS? It's like the other one, Beta. Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
He had Robotech on Beta tapes.
Wow.
And I was like, stuff. So we were watching stuff like that, and he had, he got all the stuff. I don't know. So I watched a bit of that, and I enjoyed it at the time. I really liked, there's like a movie series called Pat Labor, which it's like a mech series kind of thing. I like those ones kind of things. I think they're fun. But I don't know, the stuff that's like everything that's come out like since then, or like that I've seen, I'm sure there was like, the stuff that I just didn't know about, whatever. It's like about like kids at school and stuff, and I just don't have no, like that just seems, it seems like I would even say that like a lot of that stuff to me, I can understand if like girls watch that or whatever. I have no, that's their right, whatever. but like
befitting of their capacities.
But like, if it ends up being something like, if I were watching stuff like that, then I think the police should arrest me. They should just, it's not. There's something wrong there. So yeah, and all the like art now is like this weird, strange, like. It looks like almost like half sketched kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like it's like this weird like outline to it or whatever, where it looks like it looks less like a cartoon and more like halfway between a cartoon and a painting or something. And that looks really strange to me. I don't know. Like I find that with video games now. I look at like the PlayStation Store, and there's like a bunch of games that are just like have this very, very strange animation on it, and I'm like, where did that come from? I don't know. So I guess it's Japan. Most of the games are like that now in Japan. I don't know. So
yeah. I mean, to me, it's just like any other. Like, there's lots of different parts of pop culture and stuff that I just don't really register with me as anything interesting. I don't hate it. It's not like I have a strong reaction against it. It's just a nothing. And like metal is something like I don't really get the appeal. It all kind of sounds the same to me. I'm just not interested. I don't hate metal. I just don't care about it. And if it was something that people were kind of talking about more than, like, no one talks about metal, you know what I mean? But people talk about anime. That you know, people post that stuff on Twitter or whatever, and like if you ever mention it, it becomes like this big back and forth. Like people just split like the Red Sea and pick a camp. It's just like that's what's annoying about it. It's not the anime stuff itself. That is just something yet another thing that people do that I don't really understand or care about.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks for listening, guys. I think that wraps it up for this Q&A episode. We got through a few of them, although we did have that long jag on the poetry one, which I think worked out okay. And then, so if you enjoyed this, you can always sign up for our Patreon for the bonus episode every week. And otherwise, we'll see you next week.
Yep, see you guys.
Bye.